Imagine this. You're a young bride named Margot, just 15 years old, standing in the doorway of a stone cottage in 1347 AD. Your new husband, Hendrik, is walking toward your marriage bed. The rushes on the floor feel prickly under your bare feet as you take each anxious step. The candlelight dances across his worn face. He's almost double your age, picked by your father for his 3 pigs and half an acre of barley. Your hands tremble as you hold on to the rough woolen shift your mother made for this special night, the same one she wore and her mother before her. You can hear his friends outside through the thin walls, drunk on ale, shouting crude cheers and banging pots with wooden spoons. They won't go until they get some proof that it's really happening. You're breathing quickly as Henrik's rough fingers move toward the leather cord around your neck, and you start to think if your mother's quiet warnings about your duties could ever really get you ready for what's about to unfold in this small, smoky room that reeks of damp wool and unwashed bodies. This isn't a love story. It's a glimpse into the reality of intimacy in medieval times. It was a world where sexual practices were influenced by superstition, fear of religion, and a need to survive, all of which would likely feel completely alien to our current views on romance and desire. Before we explore these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find it fascinating to uncover the hidden aspects of history, think about hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. I'd love for you to comment below and share where you're tuning in from. It's amazing to think that we're diving into these ancient tales together, even though we're all in different corners of the world, united by our common interest in history. The medieval bedroom was like a battleground, where bodies turned into political territory. The church's teachings collided with pagan customs, and the most personal aspects of life were controlled by such strange and limiting rules that they would definitely make someone today uncomfortable. Crawl. These choices went beyond mere personal preferences. They were about eternal salvation, family honor, and even life and death. Let me take you into Margot's world, a place where marital rape wasn't recognized because wives were seen as property, where menstrual blood was thought to be so perilous that it could ruin crops, and where using the wrong sexual position could condemn your soul to hell forever. In medieval Europe, the marriage bed was never really private. The community, the church, and old superstitions all played a role in what happened between a husband and wife. When Margot married Henrik in the autumn of 1347 AD, their union wasn't celebrated with champagne or dancing. Instead, it was more like a business deal, sealed with physical intimacy and observed by neighbors who felt entitled to ask for proof of consummation. The wedding night tradition started well before the couple even made contact. It began with the bedding ceremony, where the guests would physically pull the bride and groom to their room, take off their clothes while singing raucous songs, and then gather outside the door, eagerly listening for any sounds that would prove the marriage was official. Henrik's friends refused to leave until they heard Margot's cries of pain, which indicated that her hymen had been broken and the marriage was complete. But this is where medieval intimacy becomes really strange. The church believed that even married couples could commit serious sins while in their own beds. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century AD, stated that a man who loves his wife too passionately is considered an adulterer. The church fathers thought that too much pleasure, even in marriage, corrupted the soul. This wasn't just a theory, it influenced all parts of sexual practice in medieval times. Thomas Aquinas, the prominent theologian of that era, established clear guidelines for married couples in his Summa Theologica around 1265 AD. He stated that sexual intercourse was only permitted on specific days of the week, during certain seasons, and in one particular position, with the man on top and the woman underneath, facing each other. Any departure from the norm was seen as unnatural and thus sinful. Oral sex was completely prohibited, along with sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. The church estimated that if all these guidelines were adhered to, married couples would be able to have sex only around 50 days each year. Margot likely picked up these rules from her mother, who had learned them from the village priest during confession. The weight of eternal damnation loomed over every intimate moment they shared. When Henrik reached for her on a forbidden Wednesday during Lent, she found herself in an impossible situation. Should she submit to her husband's will and jeopardize her soul, or refuse and confront his anger in a world where domestic violence was not just permitted, but anticipated? The medieval perception of female sexuality was rooted in deep misunderstandings that would endure for centuries. Medical texts from the time, shaped by ancient Greek and Roman ideas, taught that women were basically flawed versions of men. They believed that female sexual organs were just inverted forms of male genitalia. For them, the vagina was seen as an inside-out penis, while ovaries were thought of as internal testicles. This perspective wasn't just a result of ignorance. Medical knowledge was formally taught in universities throughout Europe. These ideas significantly influenced how people in the medieval period viewed female desire and pleasure. The physician Constantine the African, who wrote in the 11th century AD, asserted that women experienced sexual pleasure in a way that was distinct from men. He argued that women needed extended stimulation and could have multiple climaxes in order to conceive. This resulted in the strange medical notion that rape couldn't lead to pregnancy since the woman wouldn't experience the required pleasure. If a woman became pregnant after being assaulted, medieval courts frequently viewed it as proof that she had enjoyed it and was thus partly to blame. Margot's mother might have cautioned her about the wandering womb, a condition that medieval doctors thought could lead to hysteria, madness, and even death. People believed that the uterus could actually shift around inside a woman's body, moving up to constrict her heart or downwards to exit through the vagina. To treat this, they tried things like using pleasant scents to entice the womb back into its proper position, or using unpleasant smells to encourage it to move down. During the medieval period, there was a complicated mix of fertility beliefs that came from pagan traditions, and the church struggled to completely eliminate them. In villages, wise women, who were later often labeled as witches, preserved secret knowledge about herbs, rituals, and practices meant to help with conception, avoid pregnancy, or guarantee the birth of male children. In the woods around Margot's village, women would come together to collect certain plants during the full moon. They made teas from pennyroyal and tansy that were thought to stop pregnancy, while the line between the right dose for contraception and a lethal dose was dangerously narrow. Wearing mandre root, which looked like a human figure, against the skin was believed to boost fertility when used as an amulet. The root was considered so precious that in medieval markets, you often found forged versions made from carved bryony. The church officially denounced these practices as witchcraft, yet even the most devout Christians found it hard to completely let go of them. The distinction between folk medicine and magic was incredibly unclear. For instance, a woman might pray to Saint Margaret for a safe childbirth, while at the same time burying a piece of afterbirth under her doorstep to guarantee future fertility. She might put on a crucifix when she goes to church, but secretly keep a piece of amber hidden between her breasts to avoid having a miscarriage. Contraception in medieval times was a risky mix of superstition, toxic substances, and sheer desperation. Women were often told to jump backwards 7 times after having sex to prevent getting pregnant, or to drink wine mixed with crushed bees. The potions that were even more dangerous were those made from mercury, lead, and other toxic substances, which often resulted in the death of the woman and any chance of a pregnancy. The consequences of an unwanted pregnancy were incredibly serious. In a time without reliable contraception, women lived with the constant risk of dying during childbirth. The rates of maternal mortality were truly shocking. 1 out of every 3 women died during or shortly after giving birth. For women who were not married, being pregnant often led to social ruin, banishment, or even death. Although infanticide was officially condemned, it was commonly seen as a last resort for desperate women. During the medieval period, marriage negotiations were treated like military operations, with women's bodies as the main focus of the struggle. When Margot's father set up her marriage to Henrik, her virginity was basically her dowry, worth more than any gold or livestock he could provide. It became a form of honor, exchanged between families as evidence of their daughter's purity and their own standing. The wedding night was about more than just consummation. It involved publicly confirming the bride's virginity. The blood-stained sheets would be shown to everyone gathered as evidence that the marriage was valid. If there was no blood, the bride might be sent back to her family in shame, labeled as a fraud, or even face death. The pressure on young brides was immense. Some people would secretly poke their fingers or stash away chicken blood to create fake evidence that their new families insisted on. However, the way medieval medicine understood virginity was completely misguided. They thought that the hymen was a solid membrane that entirely sealed the vaginal opening, instead of recognizing it as the partial, flexible tissue that it really is. They believed that not having it was clear evidence of sexual activity. But in reality, it can be affected by things like horseback riding, lifting heavy objects, or even just normal differences in anatomy. The Church's rules about consummation led to some strange practices. A marriage wasn't seen as legally valid until sexual intercourse took place, which meant that figuring out whether consummation happened turned into a legal issue. Church courts would look into both the husband and wife, interviewing them separately about the private details of their wedding night. They would check the woman's body for any signs of penetration and ask neighbors what they had heard through the walls. While church doctrine tightly controlled medieval sexual positions, the actual situations were much more complicated. The missionary position wasn't just the favorite, it was the only one that wouldn't send your soul to hell. The church insisted that any position where the woman was on top went against nature, as it disrupted the natural order of male dominance. Meanwhile, rear entry was seen as animalistic, connecting human sexuality to how animals mate. But medieval literature suggests a more complicated reality. The fabliaux, those humorous stories that were popular in medieval France, depict sexual encounters that would have shocked church officials. Often shared by wandering minstrels in taverns and market squares, these tales uncover a hidden world where couples explored forbidden activities, even with the fear of eternal damnation hanging over them. The French poet Andreas Capellanus, who wrote around 1184 AD, detailed some complex courtship rituals that included specific guidance on sexual positions and techniques. His writings indicate that, at least among the nobility, there was a nuanced understanding of sexual pleasure that extended well beyond the restrictive teachings of the church. But these practices were risky secrets. Getting caught could lead to being kicked out, banished, or even killed. People in the Middle Ages were terrified of sexual demons thought to attack humans when they were at their most defenseless. The succubus and incubus weren't just stories. They were widely accepted as medical and religious truths. Church leaders believed that these demons could appear as humans to entice both men and women, draining their life energy through sexual acts. The succubus, a female demon known for seducing men, was held responsible for things like wet dreams, sexual fantasies, and any thoughts about sex that happened outside of marriage. During the Middle Ages, theologians created complex theories about the ways these demons worked. They thought that a demon could first take on a female shape to gather semen from a man and then change into a male form to impregnate a woman with that stolen seed. Any child resulting from this kind of union was believed to be cursed or demonic. The incubus presented an even bigger danger to women in medieval times. These male demons were said to be much stronger than humans and able to overpower their victims easily. Women who talked about sexual dreams or experiences they couldn't explain were frequently accused of having dealings with demons. The distinction between being a victim and being labeled a witch was alarmingly narrow. Sleep paralysis, which we now know is a neurological issue, was seen as a form of demonic sexual assault. Both men and women who woke up unable to move, often feeling a weight on their chest, were thought to be under attack from demons. The church had detailed rituals for exorcism and purification, but instead, many people thought to be possessed were burned as witches. During the medieval period, the understanding of menstruation was based on fear and superstition that lasted for hundreds of years. Menstrual blood was seen as so poisonous that it could kill plants, spoil wine, and make men lose their strength. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose writings were still examined in medieval universities, argued that menstrual blood could drive dogs crazy and make knives dull. During their monthly cycles, women were seen as hazardous contaminants who needed to be kept away from regular society. They weren't allowed to enter churches, cook food, or handle sacred items. In a lot of villages, women who were menstruating had to stay in separate huts away from the community until their bleeding ended. The church believed that menstruation was a punishment from God for Eve's original sin, which turned every monthly cycle into a reminder of shame for women. This lack of understanding about menstruation led to some really strange medical practices. Doctors thought that menstrual blood that didn't get expelled properly would build up and harm the woman from the inside. To fix this, they suggested bloodletting, purging, and other risky treatments to restore balance to the female humors. Some physicians even advised that having sexual intercourse could help with menstrual issues, as they believed that male semen could counteract the harmful effects of menstrual blood. Women in medieval times created their own secret knowledge for managing their menstrual cycles. They relied on materials like moss, cloth rags, and sheepskin for basic protection. They monitored their cycles according to the lunar phases and came up with herbal remedies to relieve cramps and regulate their flow. This information was handed down through generations of women, carefully kept away from male doctors and church officials who might label it as witchcraft. During the medieval times, people developed complex ideas about sexual compatibility that were influenced by astrological signs, bodily humors, and physical traits. Physicians of that era thought that sexual pleasure and fertility relied on achieving the right balance of hot and cold, as well as wet and dry humors in both partners. A husband who is passionate might not match well with a wife who is distant, which could result in issues with intimacy and even difficulties in having children. In wealthy families, it was typical to have potential spouses undergo physical examinations. Doctors would assess the bride's body to determine her sexual nature. For instance, wide hips were seen as a sign of fertility, while narrow hips were thought to indicate infertility. The groom's penis size and shape were assessed to see how well they matched with his future wife. These evaluations were carried out with the same clinical detachment one might use when examining livestock. Meanwhile, the church authorities came up with their own theories about sexual compatibility, focusing more on spiritual traits rather than physical ones. They believed that couples who were too closely related, whether by blood or spiritual ties, would face curses like sexual dysfunction and giving birth to deformed children. The intricate rules of familial relationships often led to medieval marriages being annulled when unexpected family ties came to light. In the medieval world, sexuality was closely linked to ideas of honor, shame, and social status. A man's ability to perform sexually was closely tied to how people viewed him as a warrior and a leader. Being impotent wasn't just a private issue. It was a public disgrace that could ruin a man's reputation in his community. In medieval France, people came up with complex euphemisms for sexual dysfunction, creating a whole language of shame that affected all parts of social life. For women, their sexual reputation was really delicate. Just a small suggestion of wrongdoing could ruin a woman's chances of getting married and damage her family's honor. In medieval towns, everyone knew each other's business since they were small communities. If a woman was spotted talking to a man who wasn't her husband or a relative, she could easily be labeled as inappropriate. The expectations for how women should behave were so strict that even married women were always anxious about rumors and being accused. The legal system in medieval times showed these sexual fears in how it dealt with cases of rape, adultery, and sexual assault. Rape wasn't seen as a crime against the woman herself, but rather as an offense against the man who had ownership over her, whether it was her father, husband, or lord. The consequences for rape could change significantly based on the social standing of both the victim and the attacker. A nobleman who assaulted a peasant woman might only have to pay a small fine, but if a peasant raped a noblewoman, he would face torture and death. Adultery was punished even more harshly, but this was only directed at women. If a married woman had relations with any man other than her husband could kill her without facing any legal repercussions. The medieval law code explicitly allowed husbands to murder their unfaithful wives and their lovers if they caught them in the act. Men, on the other hand, typically had the freedom to engage in sexual relationships with unmarried women, prostitutes, or even their own servants without facing any legal repercussions. During the medieval era, complex courtship customs emerged that would shape European culture for many years to come. The concept of courtly love, which gained popularity through the poetry of the troubadours, established a separate realm where sexual longing was transformed into a spiritual journey. These romantic ideals were mostly a literary fantasy appreciated by the nobility, but they significantly influenced how people in the medieval era viewed the connection between love and sexuality. The concept of courtly love suggested that genuine love could only flourish outside of marriage. A knight's dedication to his lady was meant to be eternally unfulfilled, existing in a state of perpetual longing that would purify the soul through its suffering. This led to a strange divide where sexual relationships and marriage were just about function, while romantic love was seen as something entirely spiritual. However, the truth about courtship in medieval times was much more practical. For those in the lower classes, young people could have some say in who they married, but financial factors always came first, overshadowing their personal choices. A girl from the village might have a crush on the blacksmith's son, but if the miller made a better offer to her father, she could end up marrying someone she hardly knew. Back in medieval times, there were certain customs for engagement that aimed to see if the future spouses were a good match. In certain areas, couples who were engaged could sleep next to each other while still dressed, with a wooden board in between them, known as a bundling board. This practice gave families the chance to see if the couple was physically compatible without the risk of pregnancy or breaking church rules about premarital sex. During the medieval period, there was a complex tradition of sexual magic and fertility rituals that came from earlier pagan cultures. Although Christian persecution pushed these practices underground, they never completely vanished. In medieval times, peasants kept practicing old fertility rituals, usually hidden under the guise of Christian festivities or mixed into folk medicine. Even though the church tried to tone it down, May Day still had a lot of sexual undertones. Young folks would often spend the night in the woods, pretending to gather flowers and branches to decorate their village. In reality, May Day provided a chance for people to explore their sexuality and form romantic connections without the usual boundaries of village life. Many pregnancies were believed to stem from these May Day interactions, which contributed to an increase in births in February. Wedding celebrations featured a variety of fertility rituals aimed at ensuring the couple would be successful in having children. People might shower the bride with grains or nuts to promote fertility. The marriage bed would be blessed with holy water, while also being secretly adorned with herbs and charms thought to boost the chances of conception. These customs reflected a deep desire to manage reproduction in a time when infant mortality rates were high, and families relied on having healthy children for their survival. Back in the medieval times, people had a strange mix of ideas about conception that combined Aristotelian philosophy, Christian beliefs, and local folk wisdom. Physicians of the time thought that both men and women contributed seed that mixed together during intercourse to form new life. They also believed that a woman needed to experience orgasm for conception to happen, which unfortunately led to the misguided notion that women who got pregnant after being raped must have somehow enjoyed the act. People in the medieval period came up with complex ideas about how to affect the sex of unborn babies. They thought that conceiving during specific phases of the moon would lead to having boys, while other phases would result in girls. Additionally, they believed that the alignment of the stars at the time of conception could impact not just the child's sex, but also their personality and future opportunities. During the medieval times, there was a noticeable increase in complex methods of controlling and monitoring sexuality. The church created systems of informants who would share information about the personal lives of those around them. Confession turned into a means of collecting private details about sexual behaviors, as priests would probe penitents about their most intimate experiences. The Inquisition's emergence in the 13th century AD led to an increase in sexual persecution. Those suspected of heresy were tortured to confess not just their religious views, but also their sexual activities. The manuals that inquisitors used during interrogations contained specific questions about sexual positions, how often people had intercourse, and even the physical sensations they felt while having sex. In medieval times, prisons had specific punishments for sexual offenses. Women found guilty of adultery could be locked in tiny cages where they couldn't even stand, surviving only on bread and water until they starved to death. Men accused of rape often faced public castration before being hanged. These harsh penalties aimed not only to punish the offenders, but also to instill fear in the whole community, ensuring everyone adhered to sexual norms. During the medieval times, there was a lot of literature focused on sexual advice and guidance, but most of it wasn't accessible to everyday people. Medical writings contained in-depth details about various sexual positions and techniques, but these were only available to educated doctors and rich patrons. The typical person back then picked up knowledge about sex through hushed talks, folk songs, and the tough lessons learned from personal experiences. The church created its own sexual literature, but its main focus was more on listing sins than on offering helpful advice. Penitential manuals compiled hundreds of sexual practices, along with the punishments for each. These writings show a curiosity about sexual details that goes against the church's stated beliefs about celibacy and purity. Medieval marriage guides aimed at rich patrons give us a peek into the intimate lives of the nobility. These books offered tips on a range of topics, including what to do on the wedding night and how to handle sexual relationships while pregnant. They show a deep awareness of sexual pleasure that wasn't shared with the general public, but was clearly embraced by those who had the means to maintain privacy and discretion. During the medieval period, people started using more complex ways to punish and control sexuality. The chastity belt, while likely not as widespread as many think, shows how far some individuals went to manage female sexuality. These devices served not only as physical restraints, but also as symbols of the fear that came with women's sexual independence. Medieval brothels existed in a sort of legal gray area. While the church officially disapproved of prostitution, local governments often granted licenses and kept an eye on it. Many medieval cities had official red light districts where sex workers operated under government oversight. These women had to wear special clothing, live in specific neighborhoods, and undergo regular health checkups. The medieval era had some of the strangest sexual customs in European history. The so-called rite of first night allegedly allowed feudal lords to sleep with their peasants' brides on their wedding night. Although historians argue about whether this practice really happened, the very idea highlights the total sexual vulnerability faced by peasant women during that time. People in the Middle Ages thought that sexual practices could affect everything, from the weather to the outcomes of wars. Kings and nobles would ask astrologers for advice on the best times for having sex, convinced that the cosmic forces at the moment of conception would shape their children's futures. Army leaders might tell their soldiers to avoid sex before a battle because they think it will sap their fighting strength. During the medieval times, people came up with more advanced ways to monitor and control sexual activity. In village communities, there were complex systems of social pressure created to manage sexual behavior. Young people hardly ever got the chance to be alone together, and married couples had to follow community norms when it came to their intimate lives. During medieval times, views on sexual pleasure were heavily shaped by religious beliefs regarding the soul and the body. The church believed that sexual pleasure was a snare laid by the devil to distract people from spiritual reflection. Even in marriage, indulging too much in sexual activity was seen as a sin that could condemn a person's soul to hell. People in medieval times came up with complex methods to manage their sexual desires and exert control over their bodies. They practiced fasting, took cold baths, and engaged in physical self-discipline to curb their sexual urges. Young people were instructed to steer clear of anything that might provoke sexual excitement, including specific foods, music, and types of entertainment. The medieval era gave rise to a rich underground culture centered around sexual defiance and rebellion. Even though the church tried to regulate human sexuality, people during that time discovered ways to express their desires and seek pleasure. This hidden realm of sexual defiance coexisted with the dominant culture of repression and control. Medieval sexuality was influenced by practical factors that most people today don't really think about. Since there was little privacy in medieval homes, sexual intercourse often took place in areas shared with children, servants, and extended family. The sounds and smells associated with sexual activity were just part of everyday life back then, in ways that would definitely surprise modern sensibilities. During the medieval period, we saw the emergence of more intricate connections between sexuality and social class. The sexual freedoms enjoyed by the nobility were tied to their overall power in society. Lords and ladies had private rooms, access to luxurious foods, and free time that enabled them to pursue sexual enjoyment in ways that peasants simply couldn't. In medieval times, marriage was more about survival than it was about love or physical pleasure. Given the short life expectancy and high rates of infant mortality, the main goal of marriage was to have children who would continue the family line and help with farming. Enjoying sex was often a minor issue at best and was frequently viewed as a risky distraction from the more pressing matters of life. The medieval era was marked by some of the strictest sexual norms in European history. Yet it also gave rise to complex forms of sexual resistance and rebellion. People in medieval times discovered ways to seek pleasure and express their desires, even in the face of immense social pressure to adhere to religious and societal expectations. As we come back to Margot in her stone cottage, with Henrik's hand still reaching for her in the flickering candlelight, we start to grasp her terror, not just as a personal fear, but as the heavy burden of an entire culture's sexual anxieties weighing down on her young shoulders. She bears the load of religious beliefs, family honor, community watchfulness, and her own urgent need to survive in a world that provides her with no safety. The medieval era highlights how human sexuality has consistently been influenced by power dynamics, fear, and societal control. The strange customs and beliefs of people during that time may seem foreign to us today, but they were rooted in the same essential human needs and desires that motivate sexual behavior across all periods. By exploring medieval sexuality, we can better understand how our current sexual culture mirrors the power structures and social anxieties we face today. Medieval intimacy wasn't really intimate at all. It was always out in the open, tied to politics, and often risky. The bedroom turned into a battleground where people fought for their souls, where family honor could either be upheld or shattered, and where even the most private aspects of life were controlled by rules that seemed aimed at taking away pleasure and increasing pain. The medieval era brought about some of the strictest sexual customs seen in European history. However, it also shows the remarkable strength of human sexual desire. Even with centuries of religious oppression, societal restrictions, and legal consequences, people in medieval times discovered ways to seek love, enjoyment, and close relationships. Their experiences highlight that sexuality is a core part of being human, strong enough to resist complete control by any authority. The unusual and sometimes unsettling sexual practices of medieval Europe didn't just come from ignorance or superstition. Instead, they developed from a complicated mix of religious beliefs, social systems, economic demands, and real human desires. By looking into these practices, we can see how much progress we've made, while also recognizing that many of the same fundamental tensions still influence human sexuality today. In conclusion, the medieval era shows us that sexuality is inherently political, often risky, and a crucial part of being human. The strange, intimate behaviors of people back then were their way of dealing with the ongoing struggle between desire and control, pleasure and danger, as well as love and survival. Their struggles remind us that the search for sexual freedom and true intimacy isn't something new. It's an age-old desire that goes beyond any specific time in history. The candlelight still dances across Henrik's worn face as he reaches out to young Margot. But now, we realize that this moment carries the full significance of medieval sexual culture. The fear, the superstitions, the desperate hope to survive, and the timeless human desire for connection, even when the odds are stacked against us. In her shaking hands and his rough fingers, we witness more than just two individuals. We see the clash of an entire civilization's sexual anxieties and desires unfolding in the most personal and intimate setting possible. But it's never really private, never completely safe, and never entirely secure.